everyone. I'm so pleased to get this hearing underway for the Environmental Protection Agency budget. And so pleased to have with us today Administrator Regan and also Acting CFO for the EPA, David Bloom. And so welcome, and welcome to my colleagues who are here today in this hearing on the fiscal year 2022 budget request for the Environmental Protection Agency. After 10 years of painful budget caps, EPA's budget today is 25% lower in real dollars than its fiscal year 2010 funding level. EPA staffing levels have dropped 20%. We're at a low point for the resources desperately needed to tackle the breadth and depth of the public health and environmental challenges facing our nation. Administration's requested budget increase for EPA is a little under $2 billion, or 22% compared to the fiscal year 2021. These levels would help reverse the funding and staffing losses EPA has suffered. But we're not here to simply recreate the old EPA. These levels would begin to remake the agency to confront the enormous challenges of today. It is an essential step. Environmental protection funding that enables a robust response to the threats communities face across our nation, from contaminated air and water, to Superfund sites, to environmental injustices, to climate chaos. In Oregon and all over the United States and the world, climate chaos is a fact of life. Last summer, devastating wildfires incinerated several of the towns in my home state of Oregon, destroying hundreds of homes, leveling businesses to the ground, tragically killing 11 individuals. I drove from the northern border to the southern border and back again more than 600 miles and never got out of the smoke. I've never seen anything like that before. But these types of fires are increasingly common. As fire season gets longer and hotter, the forests are drier. And even this summer is shaping up to be another emergency, with historic drought conditions present across the West. For the first time in 105 years, there's no water for irrigation in the Klamath Basin. It's inescapable. Climate chaos is a present-day crisis, and urgent action is essential. The prior administration rolled back clean air and climate protections. They walked away from our global commitment to address climate change. We lost ground at a moment when we need to supercharge our ambition. It's encouraging to see the Biden administration reverse that dangerous course, commit to follow the science, and work to tackle this challenge. The $1.8 billion in climate-related funding included in this proposal is a breath of fresh air after the slash-and-burn budget requests from the last administration. We need to treat this crisis as an emergency and act with boldness. These investments are an important step forward, a step towards right-sizing our climate investment. We also need urgency and boldness in addressing our nation's long history of environmental injustice. It's a tragic fact that our laws and our lack of enforcement of laws have failed to protect overburdened communities that all too often are low-income communities of color. The administration's nearly $1 billion proposed investment in environmental justice initiatives is historic and long overdue. This proposal appropriately aims to prioritize and mainstream environmental justice across all of EPA, providing the resources needed for EPA to elevate environmental justice voices within agency programs and decision-making. And I appreciate that the budget request includes more than $3 billion in funding for water infrastructure, for grants and loans, other support, including WIFIA, the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act program that I championed through the authorization and funding process years ago. I'm pleased that WIFIA has made possible a long list of clean water projects that serve 31 million Americans. But more progress is needed. A path forward for families that are facing steep water bills and shutoffs after falling behind during the pandemic. And we need programs that prioritize the small communities, often low-end communities that I hear from across Oregon, where their clean water supply and their wastewater treatment is unable to keep up with the deteriorating infrastructure built more than half a century ago, including wooden pipes that often go back 100 years, keep up with the new and important standards for clean water and for wastewater, or simply prepare for the possibility of expanding the size of a town. So, we have to come up with a lot of help for these small communities. And I'm heartened by the increases in grant funding in the budget request that are directed to this challenge. We need to rebuild our environmental protection framework, which has been battered over the last decade by budget caps and the last administration's tenure. We need to rebuild the EPA and provide long overdue relief to its state, tribal, and local partners on the front lines of implementing our environmental laws. And I'm pleased to see the proposed budget's attention to this challenge. Administrator Regan, you started your career at EPA, and I know you understand the contributions of the agency and its dedicated professionals to clean air and clean water across the country. The staffing numbers at EPA have been cut to a level not seen in almost 40 years. The President's budget request before us today would return 1,000 staff to the agency, an important step. We need to rebuild this agency that has lost 3,000 scientists, toxic cleanup specialists, environmental engineers, drinking water technicians, toxicologists, and other experts over the course of the last decade. From your leadership at the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, you're familiar with EPA's role in partnering with local leadership. In fact, half of EPA's funding is passed on to state, tribal, and community partners to support state environmental agencies, air quality monitoring, clean water infrastructure projects, and local priorities. This has certainly been important in my home state of Oregon. We need urgency, but we also need consistency, and the President's American Jobs Plan prioritizes investments to tackle climate change and environmental injustice, but it's also important that these programs are increased in the annual budget. Right-sizing our annual funding for these priorities, otherwise a one-time infrastructure investment will be followed by years of neglect and backsliding. There is no more important statement of our values than a budget, and I like the values I see in this budget, and I stand ready to help the administration provide the resources we need to tackle these really important challenges. Let me turn to my colleague, Ranking Member Lisa Murkowski from the state of Alaska for any comments she would like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. And to you, Administrator Regan, good morning. Welcome to your first budget hearing before this subcommittee. I'm glad to be joining Chairman Merkley for this very important discussion about EPA's fiscal year 2022 budget request. I'd like to open by first thanking you. It's always good to start with a thank you and notes of appreciation, but you made an early commitment to work with me on a number of issues that uniquely affect my state that are important to Alaska. You and your staff have been responsive in engaging with me and my team, and I truly do appreciate that. It's my sincere hope that this level of outreach and coordination will continue throughout your tenure as administrator. And on that note, as the agency under this administration reviews and potentially rescinds regulations that are promulgated under the previous administration, it is imperative that you engage with Congress and consider all perspectives before taking action. The agency under the previous administration, I think, struck the right regulatory balance on a number of key issues, and I would point to WOTUS as a specific example. You stated in a previous hearing that you are, quote, not satisfied, close quote, with the existing WOTUS rule. On WOTUS and many other regulations that significantly affect Alaska and the nation, my hope is that this administration not engage in the regulatory overreach that we saw under the Obama administration. So I credit you for your goal of finding common ground among varying stakeholders. And again, I can't stress how important that will be in practice on these issues. Another issue where it's important to find common ground among diverse stakeholders is on long-term protections for the Bristol Bay watershed. Last week, I had an opportunity to visit Dillingham out in the Bristol Bay region to begin discussions on what protections may be needed and really the overall future of the region. I was able to reiterate my commitment to developing a long-term, durable solution and began the process to develop a legislative proposal based off of input from regional stakeholders. And Administrator Regan, as I shared with you and the other EPA nominees that I have had an opportunity to speak with, I think I've been pretty clear in my concerns about the use of the 404C veto for the Pebble deposit. I hope you'll be working with us on legislative protections and not relying solely on heavy-handed administrative approaches. Again, my interest here is to find an enduring solution here, and I'd like to work with you on that. Now, turning to fiscal year 2022, the EPA's budget request totals approximately $11.2 billion. That's almost a 22% increase over last year's funding level. This, along with $116 billion proposed in the American Jobs Plan, is really a stunning amount of proposed funding for the agency. This budget request and the American Jobs Plan are both proposals as of now, and of course Congress will ultimately decide the fate of both. There are a number of proposed increases in the request that I can support and a number that I cannot. I appreciate the request's commitment to state and tribal grant and loan programs that lead to on-the-ground improvements for communities across the country. In my time with this subcommittee, and particularly as chair, I've worked hard to provide increases to the many EPA programs that achieve the real substantive results in attaining cleaner air, water, and lands for the people of Alaska and across this great country, and I will continue to do so. I will say that I am disappointed to see that the Alaska Native Villages program and the Targeted Airshed program are held flat in a request that does include so many increases. These are grant programs that really help to address some important and significant problems in the state of Alaska, so I would hope that we would see increases in future requests for both. On the American Jobs Plan and infrastructure spending, if an infrastructure bill is passed, and I'm one of those that's working to try to do just that, it is critical that remote and rural communities are able to easily access funding, which is a challenge many such communities face. The administration's proposal makes mention of funds for underserved communities, but lacks details that provide assurance that the funding will be meaningfully helpful in remote communities, such as we have in so many of our Native villages across the state. It is critical that you and really all of us work to ensure that steep barriers to entry on infrastructure funding, such as high matching requirements, are avoided for these very smaller communities. So to close, I will reiterate that I do appreciate your commitment to working with me on so many of these issues that are important to Alaska, but also very, very unique, and I think you have noted that. I'll be asking you about a number of them in my questions this morning. I look forward to your continued help towards making progress on these and so many issues that are important to our country. Thank you, Administrator, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski. Senator Leahy, did you wish to make an opening statement?
No, we'll have questions.
Okay. Very good. Administrator Regan, we'll turn it over for your opening statement. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chairman Merkley and Ranking Member Murkowski and members of the subcommittee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the EPA's President's Budget request for fiscal year 2022. For half a century, EPA has worked hard to provide the American people with clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and safe, healthy land. EPA's dedicated career staff at our headquarters in Washington, D.C. and throughout the 10 regions work every day to improve the lives of our people across this great nation and have risen to the occasion presented to us through the COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier this month, President Biden sent to Congress EPA's budget request for $11.2 billion. If enacted, this budget would help ensure that EPA continues to meet its essential mandate by providing the resources necessary to confront our environmental challenges, especially in our overburdened communities. EPA's mission is to protect human health and the environment. To achieve these goals, we must have resources to help all communities across the nation who are on the front lines of protecting public health and cleaning up pollution. That's why almost 50% of the President's budget request for EPA supports EPA's state and tribal partners through the State and Tribal Assistance Grant Program. State and tribal leaders know their communities better than the federal government ever could. It is also why the budget of every place-based program, from the San Francisco Bay to the Chesapeake Bay, was increased. These programs are key to managing and accelerating the restoration of our nation's treasured water bodies, which help sustain local and regional economies. Ensuring access to clean and safe water for all Americans is another priority for this administration. At EPA, we've seen that investing in water infrastructure is a win-win for public health and for economic development. The 2022 budget provides $3.6 billion to EPA to rebuild our water infrastructure with targeted increases to our state revolving loan funds. These programs assist states, tribes, and territories with infrastructure projects that help provide clean water and safe water management in all communities across the country. Water infrastructure investments, however, only represent one aspect of clean and safe water. The agency will also invest resources and expand efforts to address the pervasive and persistent chemicals known as PFAS in our drinking water. As part of the President's commitment to tackle PFAS pollution, the budget provides approximately $75 million to accelerate toxicity studies and funds research to inform our regulatory process. Additional funds for technical assistance grants have also been set aside for state and local governments to deal with PFAS contamination in their own communities. Under the President's leadership, we are taking action to tackle climate change to ensure a livable planet for our future generations. This budget invests in programs that will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including $100 million for air quality grants directly to states and tribes to tackle emission levels on a local and regional scale. An additional $30 million will help improve the knowledge of the impacts of climate change on human health and the environment through our scientific research programs. Much like climate change, environmental justice underpins all of our work. The pandemic ignited a perfect storm for communities of color and low-income communities who already bear the highest burdens of pollution, suffer the highest rates of mortality from heart and lung disease, and recently COVID-19 as well. The budget invests $936 million toward new accelerating environmental and economic justice initiatives for efforts across the agency that will help create jobs, clean up pollution, and secure environmental justice for communities who have been left behind far too often. In the 40 years since Congress' creation of the Superfund program, we've made significant progress, but much work remains to be done. Under my leadership, EPA will do everything in its power to hold responsible parties accountable for environmental degradation and return land to safe and productive use for communities. Our budget provides $882 million for Superfund remedial programs to clean up America's most contaminated land. That's a $293 million increase. Our budget provides $882 million for Superfund remedial programs to clean up America's most contaminated land, reduce emissions of toxic substances, and respond to environmental emergencies, oil spills, and natural disasters. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, the fiscal year 2022 budget will help ensure EPA can meet the interconnected health and environmental crisis we face, lift up communities who have long been left behind, and put the nation on a prosperous path to economic recovery. And EPA is ready to meet those challenges. So thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your continued partnership and welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Administrator Regan. And it's a real chance for us to dive into different elements that the senators are interested in. I wanted to start with the staffing strategy that you're laying out in this budget. Folks may say, you want to hire 1,000 more people. What are those 1,000 more people going to do? Why are they essential?
You know, it's essential that we have the adequate resources and workforce to protect America's resources, air, water, and land. In 2008, we had over 18,000 employees. We've seen a decline over quite a few years, especially the last 4 years, and now we're right around 14,000. That is not an adequate workforce to protect America's people. So we're asking for the increase of just over 1,000 employees, a significant number that we lost over the past 4 years, but the numbers we believe we need to focus on providing the appropriate research scientific research, the analytical capabilities to inform our regulations, but more importantly, the capabilities and capacity in our regional offices to provide the partnership and the technical expertise for activities that are occurring on the ground.
So you're saying that even with this increase, you'll still be 3,000 employees fewer than where you were at 4 years ago?
In 2008, we were at 18,000. And so, yes, with this increase, we will still have a significantly reduced workforce. On top of that, like many agencies, we have a workforce that's in transition, an aging workforce. What we hope to do with this 1,000 employees is replenish the capacity that we've lost, but also build the capacity that we need for future activities to protect our air, water, and land.
Well, that's pretty important, and I was very struck that almost half your workforce is retirement eligible in just 5 years. So we're going to continue to see rebuilding a younger team that will be there for the next generation to take us forward. I wanted to turn to the funding that you send out to the states, and you saw it directly in your role in North Carolina. And so can you give me a sense from your work on the ground how important that federal EPA funding was in supporting your efforts inside North Carolina or more broadly in other states?
Absolutely. It's critical. When you think about the awesome responsibilities that the states have through a delegated authority, they are responsible for protecting their communities. So these precious resources that we pass through to the states are critical for their success. Whether that be repairing aging water infrastructure, protecting individual communities from PFAS pollution, or looking at the equal distribution of protection through environmental justice and equity.
Is there any one particular example you can draw from North Carolina of a project that was advanced because of those federal funds?
You know, there are a number that we can talk through. I think when we look at the mixture of economic development and environmental protection, the resources we got for our brownfields programs were critical. I actually got a chance to oversee the 600th brownfield site redeveloped in North Carolina, and the amount of revenue that flows from these redeveloped lands are just awesome. The same goes for water infrastructure. We've got an aging water infrastructure across this country. North Carolina was no different. Significant needs there. Without adequate federal-state partnership, we risk vulnerabilities to our good quality drinking water.
You still have communities with wooden pipes like we do in the West?
You know, we have communities with wooden pipes. We have communities with lead pipes. We have communities with pipes that are over 100 years old. This is absolutely no way to deliver good quality drinking water to the American citizens.
Thank you. So the most important challenge, the most biggest challenge to humanity on this planet is climate chaos. And you're dedicating a significant amount of resources in your budget to tackling this challenge. Can you paint maybe what are the 2 or 3 most important aspects of your proposed effort are?
You know, the funding there is critical to ensure that we have the science to inform the decisions that we have to make. Those resources are really critical in terms of the scientific integrity, the quantification of the impact, and ensuring that we know how to predict where we're going to be and provide the right solutions. So as we think about solutions, and what I mean in terms of solutions is as we look at potential rulemakings that will capture the imagination of the future using the latest technologies to get deep cuts like in pollution like methane, we really need those resources for the ability to quantify the technologies available, understand the science, but more importantly, engage with our partners on the ground so that we are providing the right solutions for each state.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn now to Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot to talk about here this morning, so I appreciate this conversation. Let me begin, Administrator, with the subject that I raised in my opening statement, concerns about the likelihood of the agency potentially rewriting the current WOTUS rule. I have described the Obama administration's approach to WOTUS as a showstopper. certainly negative consequences to Alaska. Approximately 2/3 of the state of Alaska is already considered wetlands, and so if you have an overreaching WOTUS rule, you've got real complications in terms of what most would consider relatively minor and routine projects that would then be subject to a level of review that most would say is just beyond belief. So the question for you this morning is, what is the current status of the review of the rule, on whether or not the agency has any timeline for future actions on the existing rule?
So, what I would say is I've been traveling and talking with a number of individuals, industry, state leaders. I was in North Dakota last week discussing this very rule. I'm being consistent with what I've said before, which is we are evaluating the path forward because we believe that we've got some lessons learned from previous actions. We look at some of the complexities that you've referenced and many have referenced in the Obama rule. We're looking at what I believe to be an abdication of some responsibilities for water quality protection under the current rule. There are lessons learned for both. What I'm committed to do is engaging with the Secretary of USDA, with the Army Corps of Engineers, with the agriculture community, and with the communities that are impacted, and Congress, to best understand how do we have a long-term, durable solution and not continue to have the ping-ponging back and forth.
Well, I appreciate that, and the fact that you are going out, whether it's to North Dakota or other places, you're holding listening sessions. You've indicated that you're going to be doing that this summer with stakeholders. I appreciate that. Can you tell me if you're planning to hold any such sessions in Alaska?
I don't believe we've mapped out,
okay.
But I do know that we can definitely consider your request as we map out listening sessions. I was in North Dakota last week, and during the confirmation for the Assistant Administrator of Water, she committed to holding a listening session in North Dakota. Our goal really is to hold listening sessions in places that felt that they did not get a chance to voice their concerns. And so we're mapping that out, and we'll continue to work closely with you.
Well, and if you can just keep us apprised of that and your progress along the way, because, again, critically important in a state like ours. Another issue that people are talking about everywhere, some more loudly in other communities than others, is the issue that you have raised of PFAS. I was out in Dillingham this past week, up in Fairbanks this past week, and the issue of PFAS is considerable to both of them, but we have other communities down in Gustavus. They're trying to do some repairs or extension of a small little airstrip there, and they've got PFAS contamination that is really quite a concern to that small community. Up on the North Slope, the community of Utqiagvik, I'm very concerned about the implications for health and what we're doing. When I was chairman of this subcommittee, I prioritized PFAS funding for both the research and the need for regulatory actions and for getting money to the states to help with remediation in the absence of federal guidelines. So I appreciate that the agency under your leadership is building on the previous administration's PFAS action plan with the establishment of the EPA Council on PFAS. So can you kind of walk me through, and I know other members are very concerned about this as well, what the agency's timeline is for listing PFAS or any of the specific compounds listing as a hazardous substance. And I'm just trying to understand, because when we don't have federal guidelines, it's difficult to help the states and local communities take on this matter of PFAS contamination.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, in the budget, we're requesting at least $75 million to focus on accelerating some of the toxicity studies that we have underway. to inform our regulatory approach. And part of that $75 million also, again, we're really focused on state and state partnerships. We provide grants to help state and local governments deal with PFAS contamination right now. We started the process of setting the primary drinking water regulation for both PFOA and PFAS and developing a monitoring rule to improve EPA's understanding of the occurrence of this in our nation's drinking water. We've also issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to solicit data to improve our understanding of the treatment of PFAS in our wastewater discharge. And we've sent a proposed rule to OMB that would require manufacturers to import PFAS chemicals to report on the historic uses, the production volumes, just a lot of information that we've never collected and don't have. And I've announced a policy, or we've announced a policy designed to prevent the introduction of new unsafe PFAS into commerce, something we're working with the Department of Commerce on. So those activities plus the $75 million budget request overlaid with what you've identified, which is me establishing a PFAS council, we've got all hands on deck. And I can assure you, being on the receiving end of a PFAS issue in the state of North Carolina, it is a priority for me and it's a priority for this agency.
Well, I appreciate that. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman, but again, what I'm hearing from folks back home is when are they going to be listing this? You've outlined, I think, very thoroughly what we're doing to put resources in place to make sure that we're getting the research and understanding again about the toxicity. But if there is any semblance of a timeline that you think might be realistic, I think that helps people.
I will have staff provide you with that information.
Super. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Senator Murkowski for having this hearing. And Administrator, it's great to see you here. Thank you for being here. Now, you may find, and I'm sure this will not be totally surprising to you, that in hearings before the Appropriations Committee, sometimes some of the questions may seem a tiny bit parochial. And I just wanted to alert you to that had you not been aware. I do like President Biden's budget with his commitments on climate change, environmental protection, justice, community, resilience, and they're not empty gestures. They're a cornerstone of this administration. And the budget proposal is a statement of values that will, I think, help prepare the agency. I've been concerned about some of the dismantling attacks that subverted science, threatened our basic environmental laws. And in our state, Republicans and Democrats are agreed we want to protect the environment. So I'm pleased that the request includes funding for EPA's geographic programs, including $20 million for Lake Champlain. The funding for Lake Champlain, which the previous administration repeatedly sought to eliminate, is fundamental to your mission. The dollars leverage a broad network of stakeholders, experts, funding stream to support our goal of a drinkable, swimmable, fishable lake. It is, outside of the 5 Great Lakes, it's the largest body of fresh water in our country. We're doing a lot to reduce runoff, combat invasive species. So my question is, in what ways do EPA's different geographic programs, like those for Lake Champlain and the Great Lakes, benefit one another, and why is it important to continue these programs?
Well, thank you for that question and the acknowledgement. We all acknowledge that these are national treasures. Lake Champlain, our bays, our Pecosins. This is really important, and I think the President's budget reflects that priority, $36 million increase over last year's budget to focus on the protection of these water bodies. It's critical that we, number one, partner with our states to protect these national treasures for a couple of reasons. The first, because we want to preserve the ecological vitality and what they mean to us all culturally. But from an economic standpoint, significant revenue driver for our local communities as well. And what you'll see in the President's budget is not only resources dedicated to the geographical programs, as I've mentioned, but in the infrastructure resources in general, you'll see that we're going to focus on both hardened infrastructure that is resilient to climate change, but we're also focused on natural infrastructure that will help to protect and preserve our national treasures as well.
You're going to have more work than you can possibly handle, but if you want a chance to see what this looks like, you have an open invitation from me, and I'll come with you and show you what I think is a very attractive area. Has New York on one side, us on the other, and Canada to the north. So you have an open invitation to join me there at any time. And last September, just as people are getting ready to return to in-person learning, students at Burlington High School, and Burlington's our largest city, very small by other states' standards, large by Vermont's, they're forced to relocate to a temporary site, actually a former Macy's department store, because testing had found levels of PCBs in the school that exceeded the state threshold. In the case of one building, the EPA minimum standards. And it's so pervasive, the building is going to be torn down, and they're going to have to build one on another site. Of course, these PCBs were used a lot in school construction through the 60s and 70s. So I suspect you're going to see this all over the country, the problem, and I appreciate your setting out standards. So my one question is this: the threat to the health of the students at Burlington High School, and a son of mine graduated from there. It was discovered only by chance as the school prepared for new renovations. Many more schools were built in my state of Vermont and every state represented around here before EPA banned PCBs in '79. What proactive steps can EPA take to ensure the full scope of this risk is understood and dealt with?
I think that's a great question, and part of it really flows to the core of this budget, which is ensuring that the states have the resources and that we have the resources to have the proper partnership. As we evaluate the toxicity level of many of these chemicals, past and present, that we care so much about, it really does boil down to EPA's ability to provide technical assistance and partnership with the states. And so as we see states all across the country struggling with PCB, asbestos, and the like, we're looking at the risk evaluation of these pervasive chemicals and the partnership opportunities with how the states can take the lead with the federal backing to address some of these issues that are more localized.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Reed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Administrator Regan. One of the issues that we've worked on is the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act, and I was involved with colleagues in trying to include significant resources of cybersecurity, which is the issue du jour and the issue for the next generation, perhaps. And also I noticed that the EPA budget includes $3.8 million boost to improve cybersecurity practice for public water systems. Can you comment on how you would implement this funding and coordinating with other agencies, particularly Homeland Security, cybersecurity, infrastructure security agencies? And again, from my experience on the defense panel, cybersecurity is not a passing fad. It is going to be a compelling factor as long as we're around. So please.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And, cyber attacks against our water and wastewater are occurring more frequently. Something that I thought about quite often as a secretary in the state of North Carolina. And in addition to the resources we're asking under the umbrella of the infrastructure request that the president has proposed, about $4 million of that, as described in the president's budget, about that $4 million, and then I think we are looking at about 6 FTE that would be focused squarely on cybersecurity. I would say Homeland Security is an invaluable partner, but we've also got the state emergency officials and partnerships with the governors that are critical there as well. So when we think about the resiliency of our water infrastructure, we're thinking about that physical resiliency, but we're also thinking about that sort of software, hardware piece that cybersecurity is invaluable for.
And a particular concern is the coordination with the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. There has to be a central point where information is gathered and disseminated, and you feel comfortable that you've established that rapport yet?
I do. I feel comfortable that we have a rapport established, one that we will continue to work and strengthen as this issue becomes more prevalent.
Thank you. I'm also pleased to see the EPA budget propose a significant increase in the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, the DERA program. It's critical up in my state, and it's particularly critical in low-income communities of color, which typically suffer from more exposure to these types of pollution. We have in the Port of Providence, for example, a great deal of diesel activity with shipping and other vehicles coming in and out, and no surprise, located to relatively low-income communities. Could you comment on that?
I couldn't agree with you more. The DERA program is such an important program, and I hate to continue to refer to my time as Secretary in North Carolina, but we received DERA funds, and it made all the difference in the world. I think the President's budget recognizes the importance of the DERA program, which is why we're asking for an increase of about 60-some%. The goal, obviously, is to transition to an electric future. But looking at the placement of cleaner diesel technologies right now is so important, especially in our lower income communities, and especially when we think about transportation like school buses that carry some of the most precious cargo in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. Final point is that the clean and drinking water revolving funds are critical to every state. I'm sure North Carolina was no exception. And we've been experiencing severe storms, et cetera. And with this in mind and thinking about these revolving funds, what steps are you taking to ensure that when we rebuild infrastructure, that we do it with climate change in mind, not just what the history or not just the next year or two, but looking ahead at some of the projections that go out about 10 or 20 years?
You know, that we have significant strong partnerships with our states on these loan fund programs, and at the core of all of the conversation has been that topic of resiliency from cyber attacks, but as well as from climate threats as well. It's critical that we don't just put Humpty Dumpty back together the same way. We know that we have to be prepared. And one important point I want to make is the reason that EPA is so focused on the science is so that we can predict the intensity of these storms so that we know how to design the infrastructure to withstand the inevitable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Administrator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. And Administrator, thank you so much for being here this morning. I want to start with a statement and just say how deeply unsatisfied I am with the current WOTUS rule. According to the New Mexico Environment Department, 96% of the wetlands and waterways in New Mexico are not covered by that rule. I'll give you an example. Major portions of the Santa Fe River, which provides 40% of the drinking water for the city of Santa Fe, is not covered by that rule because the nature of waterways in New Mexico are that they are seasonal. That is what happens when you have snowpack in a desert environment. And to disregard the critical nature of those waterways in producing clean water for drinking, producing water for agriculture, producing water for industry, and the importance of protecting those waterways, I just think this rule was horribly written, and I would urge you to revisit it as soon as possible, and I would invite you to engage with the New Mexico Environment Department, because they're in the difficult position of not having backup rules for the state of New Mexico, because they actually relied on the federal previous WOTUS rules under the Obama administration. I want to talk a little bit, and some of my colleagues have focused on this, but many rural and small communities need financial assistance to maintain their clean drinking water and wastewater systems. But the system that we have and the revolving funds, the grants, they really rely heavily on local matching funds. Mm-hmm. And as you probably recognize with your experience, in some of these low-income communities that have had historic underinvestment in infrastructure and simply don't have the tax base, those matching funds are unrealistic. And so we have a lot of communities where because even a 10% match, much less a 25 or a 50% match, we're simply not upgrading the water infrastructure as a result of the matches. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask you if you had given consideration to this, if you've thought about how we can in communities where the community can afford that, I have communities where clearly the tax base is there to make that match. But I also have communities where it is absolutely prohibitive to have that kind of match. So have you given much thought to how we, reevaluate the structure to make sure we are making those investments in historically underserved communities?
Yes, thank you for that question, and we've given it a lot of thought, and I've thought carefully about how we really partner with the states at the state level. There's enough autonomy for the states to determine some of these matching levels, and we see it swing from 10% to 40%. I think we want to look at some consistency there. We want to do it in a way that we partner with the states, not to have federal overreach, but encourage a scenario that addresses exactly what you've laid out. We've also collectively in the states and the federal government have to take a look at what flexibilities we have in our fund programs to determine which are loans at a normal rate, which are zero interest loans, and then what flexibilities do we have just for grant programs. We know for sure that there are communities out there that just don't have the capacity or the resources to take out a loan. And so we've given careful thought to that, and we'll continue to partner with you all on that.
If you need additional authorities, please ask for them, because I think this is critical. If you look at a very remote village in states like Alaska, or we have communities in New Mexico that are hours away from the nearest major city that actually has a more traditional wastewater system, et cetera, we need to be able to serve those communities. So ask us for that. And one example of that is the colonias that we have along the border. Those are communities where there simply is not the tax base. Unfortunately, I'm disappointed to learn that the EPA's U.S.-Mexico Border Water Infrastructure Program was flat funded. The Rural Community Assistance Partnership estimates the need there at $10 billion, and yet that was flat in a budget that is largely very robust. So I would urge you to look at that program and consider how we can better meet that need. Because if you think about frontline and historically underserved communities, I would think that those colonias would be very much within that definition.
Yes, we have carefully looked at that, and one of the things that you'll see in this budget is the overlay, whether it's infrastructure, brownfield, superfund, you see the overlay of environmental justice and equity. There are considerable grant dollars in those programs that address unique challenges for underserved communities, whether that be air quality monitoring, water quality, water infrastructure. So we'd love to work with your staff to see if you don't see it line itemed in one category, where there may be some supplementation in other categories.
Very much look forward to that.
Thank you.
Senator Murkowski has a comment on that topic, and then we'll turn to Senator Van Hollen.
Yes, and I will be brief so that Senator Van Hollen can go, but I want to speak to this issue of environmental justice and water and wastewater and what it means to communities that don't have the ability to make this match. I asked my staff to bring up this poster, and I don't know if you can see it back there. But what this is a four-wheeler here. Two gentlemen are dumping the contents of a honey bucket. A honey bucket it's basically a Home Depot plastic bucket where people go to the bathroom. And so he is dumping human waste from honey buckets that have been just dumped into a bucket. They run the four-wheeler down the boardwalk, and this is the dumping station, which is basically a lagoon on the tundra. This is the wastewater sanitation system in some of the villages that I have in my state. And Senator Heinrich, you've talked about some of the conditions in areas of New Mexico. Our reality is that this is an injustice that most Americans would say, I cannot believe that this is happening. I cannot believe that we would allow this in a community in the United States of America. And yet this is not just one example. In the wintertime, this waste freezes. We call it a shit-sickle. And I don't mean to make light of it, but this is the reality that we face in some of our communities. So when we talk about environmental justice, it is really about some pretty basic things. It's water and it's sanitation, and these kinds of pictures need to really be put in the history books. So I wanted to just add my concern. I raised it in my opening statement, but when you have communities that don't have the ability to put together these matching requirements, we have great funds that are available at the federal level, but they're not accessible to the very small communities. And so they take the situation into their own hands, and this is the result. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me jump in before
Mr. Chairman,
Senator
I'll
Van Hollen.
be very, very brief, but the point that the ranking member is making is many of these communities never got infrastructure in the first place, and we should address that.
Thank you. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Murkowski. Mr. Administrator, good to see you. I'm going to start by talking about the Chesapeake Bay. We've talked about it before. As you know, 6 states and the District of Columbia drain into the Chesapeake Bay. That's why about 50 years ago, those states and the federal government agreed that the EPA had to play a vital role in protecting the Bay. In April, a group of Chesapeake Bay senators sent you a letter outlining the challenge. And what I'm looking for today is your commitment to work with us to make sure that we meet the cleanup goals by 2025. Do we have that commitment?
We do.
Thank you. Now, if you look at the implementation plans, the watershed implementation plans of the various states, one state stands out as not being in compliance, and that's the state of Pennsylvania. If you just look at their current cleanup plan, they will acknowledge that they only will achieve 75% of the target needed to reach the cleanup goals by 2025. So do we have your commitment that you'll work with us to make sure that Pennsylvania meets its goals under the 2025 agreement?
We want to facilitate this process so that everyone meets the goals that have been set out for protecting this national treasure.
Okay. If you could get back to us with your plan for how you're going to hold everybody accountable. Can you do that? Thanks.
We can do that.
Now, one way to really, coordinate this effort, because it does require coordination. A lot of the, runoff into the bay that needs to be addressed is from agriculture runoff, which doesn't come necessarily directly under the jurisdiction of the EPA in all cases. And there are grants supplied by the Department of Agriculture that could be helpful to farmers. So we need much better coordination, which is why the Obama administration had appointed kind of a quarterback at EPA, the senior advisor to the administrator who could work with other agencies. I believe it's your intent, but can you confirm that you plan to fill that position?
We're looking at filling that position, and we're trying to determine the director of the office of the Chesapeake Bay there in Region 3. What we want to do with these resources that we're pushing forward is make that office more muscular and have that office and that position as the expertise that's whispering in the administrator's ear. So we're evaluating whether or not it's making that office more muscular and having the right leadership there, or having someone in the administrator's office that what I would perceive to be could be detached from what we have started there. So I think we're looking at what is the best scenario for me to have the best advice on the ground on how to coordinate on these efforts.
Well, Mr. Administrator, okay, my understanding was that the agency, you had decided to move forward with this other position. Let me just stress that I think the Maryland delegation and others think it's really important. I'm glad. I would like to see a more muscular Region 3. I'm all for that. I don't see this as an either-or situation. As I mentioned, the Region 3 administrator can be muscular within EPA's authority. But there are many other pieces to this cleanup puzzle, including the Department of Agriculture. And you're going to need somebody who is 24/7 making sure all the other agencies that are involved in the cleanup effort are at the table and doing their job. So we'll follow up with you on that. Let me ask you a question about your sort of air pollution control systems, and including climate change. If you look at the city of Baltimore, we've talked about this, asthma-related hospitalizations were 3 times the national average in 2010. Twice the Maryland average, and that's due to heightened air pollution from 13 fossil fuel burning power generation plants in that area. How will community air monitoring in the budget expand efforts of air pollutant control agencies to reduce greenhouse gases that EPA regulates, also have a beneficial impact in these areas?
We've asked for in this budget approximately $100 million specifically for air quality monitoring in these communities of concern, the communities that have been disproportionately impacted or underserved. It will be of great help to have the adequate monitoring in these communities so that we have the data on the ground so that we can enforce the regulations at the level we do to reverse the trends that we've seen with this disproportionate impact.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. I'd be remiss if I didn't say I support your budget. I was glad to see the budget request for the Chesapeake Bay. The previous administration first zeroed it out and then dramatically cut it. So we're grateful for the budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
In our effort to go back and forth between D's and R's, we only have one Republican team member with us, so we're going to return to Lisa Murkowski and then to Senator Tester.
Mr. Administrator, we've had an opportunity to talk about the Targeted Airshed Grant Program. As I have shared with you, I have many residents in the Fairbanks North Star Borough who rely on wood stove heating, and they've had real difficulties over the years meeting EPA air quality requirements. The Targeted Airshed Grant Program has been really helpful for them. So I'm pleased that we were able to secure a $14.7 million grant for the Fairbanks North Star Borough to take actions like wood stove changeout. I had an opportunity when I was home in Fairbanks last week to speak with the 3 mayors in the region, and this issue was raised. The problem that we have faced, and I have raised with you, is that there's been this recent report that finds that EPA's oversight of certification standards and testing have led to this systematic failure where effectively these newer stoves do not provide the pollution reduction that has promised. And so, as I mentioned to you, we've got to address this. We can't be in a situation where the EPA continues to find that Fairbanks is not meeting the air quality standards, while at the same time it's allowing wood stoves to enter the market that don't hit the agency's standards. So question for you today is whether or not the agency is planning on revising its standards for the wood stove, kind of where we are with the timeline, and really perhaps more broad to the problem is what is the agency doing to conduct proper testing and oversight of the wood stoves that are entering the market? We want people to be making wise investments for all the right reasons, and the right reasons will be they'll be able to keep their homes warm while at the same time working to reduce emissions.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. We have talked about that, and I've pressed my folks on that very issue, and we recognize the unique situation there. I think we have been actively working to improve the testing and the certification on that side of the ledger. I think we're making progress there. The air quality in Alaska is improving considerably, but we do have some of those remaining issues. So what we've done in this budget as a reflection have put forward resources that we would push to the states, as well as EPA's responsibility to help to ensure that the proper wood stoves are coming to market and that we're collectively working with you guys on the ground to get those change-outs done as needed. I think we're also reevaluating test methods that will specifically capture the uniqueness of Alaska to be ensured that we're measuring the right thing and not having a one-size-fit-all, and then also really focused again on that wood stove change-out program. So we've recognized the uniqueness. I believe that we've been responsive in terms of the questions that your staff have posed, but also the questions that the states have posed to us. I think we're working with them hand in glove on that.
Okay, well, if we can just keep really close on this, because again, people want to make the investments, but they also want to know that that the wood stoves that they're purchasing are actually going to be in compliance, and that they're not going to see EPA regs coming out next year saying what you bought, what you spent money on doesn't cut it right now. So this is important. So let's keep working on this. Yes. Another issue in Fairbanks, I'm kind of Fairbanks centric today. This relates to a building that has a fair amount of history in Fairbanks. It's the tallest building in town. It's 11 stories. But it has been vacant for a period of years. It is not only an eyesore, but it is a hazard. It is filled with contaminants like asbestos. It desperately needs to be remediated, redeveloped, but it sits right in the core of downtown. City of Fairbanks can't demolish and redevelop in this area without some option for remediation. And part of our problem is we have no place to dispose of hazardous materials. Basically, any hazardous materials that we have to ship down to the lower 48. So that's a considerable cost and a challenge. So we've just been stymied with how to deal with this extreme liability, environmental liability, and liability to the community. So we've been looking for sources of funding within EPA to help address this. I use this as a specific example of a larger problem, which is how we can take steps to make remediation of contaminated sites in Alaska more affordable. Because right now, our projects get stopped before we even get started because it's too expensive on paper, because we can't get rid of the contaminated materials. So this is, my time has expired. I want to be courteous to Senator Tester here, but this is a big issue for us. And as we're thinking about this broader infrastructure package and how we put in place infrastructure, whether it is expanding airports or docks, fact of the matter is in most places in this country, before you can put something new in, you got to get rid of the old, and the old has contamination. And so we're looking at spending a lot of dollars to build things. I think we're going to be surprised at how expensive it is to start with the building, because we're dealing with so much when it comes to issues of contamination. You're talking about Superfund, but we're talking about just how do you make the plate clean so that you can start something new, whether it's in Fairbanks with the Polaris building or what we're going to be trying to do with this broader infrastructure package.
Well, thank you for that. And what I can do is commit to get the details about that specific situation there to see which program it may fit in or what aspect of that applies to what we're asking for in our budget and the American Jobs Plan.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tester.
Thank you, Chairman Merkley and Ranking Member Murkowski. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you, Administrator Reagan.
Yes.
I don't know, and I ask this question in good faith, if you're familiar with the selenium issue in Lake Koocanusa coming out of a mine in Canada?
I'm not.
Okay, that's good. Well, actually, it's not good, but it's okay. Canada has a mine that's been releasing enough selenium into the water that Canada fined the company $60 million for threatening fish health and with their wastewater. It's the largest fine in Canadian history, okay? That water flows directly into Lake Koocanusa, which is in my state, and that selenium continues to be elevated all the way down to Idaho. The company up in Canada is operating these mines, proposing a new untested treatment technology to stop the selenium contamination. Unfortunately, back in 2017, this same watershed, they had a spectacular failure, which once again didn't solve the problem. So the question is that we've got to pressure Canada. Okay, it's similar to a statement that I made in ENR yesterday. There's some places where we should mine, and there's some places we shouldn't. Headwaters of a river probably isn't the best place to mine, if you know what I mean. So the question is what is the EPA doing? Do you know? If you don't know, you can say I don't know, which is fine, because now it's on your radar screen.
Yeah, it's on my radar screen now.
Okay, good.
And I can commit to you that we'll take a look at that. What I can say is I've been in constant communication with my Canadian counterpart and my Mexican counterpart to better understand these types of issues.
So there's one other thing you got to do. You got to get a hold of your counterpart at the State Department, because they're part of this equation, and engage with them and the International Joint Commission. This is a big deal. Water is life. If we don't have good water, it ain't just the fish that are going to die, okay?
That's right.
So it's really important. Now I want to talk to you about asbestos, one of those great issues that you have to deal with. Up in Libby, they've been struggling with it. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's a huge Superfund site. By the way, that we've done some good work up there, but there's a lot more work to be done. Look, I got a guy to come bid on the siding of my house. I live a long ways from Libby. And he pointed out to me that he has, I believe, 18 or 20% lung dysfunction because of mesothelioma, because he was raised in Libby, okay? Not his whole life either, just a few years. So it's a big issue. And asbestos, we can go down the list. Tens of thousands of people have died from it. It is not banned outright yet. And so the question is, do you believe the EPA has the authority under TSCA to regulate legacy issues of asbestos?
We're closely looking at that. I do. I believe that one of the initial catalysts for TSCA was focused on asbestos. It is one of the top 10 that we're looking and doing a risk evaluation to determine what regulatory action we should take as it regards to asbestos.
So let me back it up a little bit, because my hearing isn't very good. You did say that you believe that EPA has the ability to regulate under TSCA?
Yes, I do believe that EPA has the ability
and you
to regulate.
Did say that you're working on a risk evaluation?
Yes.
When do you anticipate that will be out?
I'll have to get you that timeline, but I do know it's one of the top 10 chemicals listed under the TSCA law that requires a risk evaluation immediately as prioritized.
Yeah, so you will get me that timeline. That'd be great. And then based on that evaluation, you should probably be able to tell me whether asbestos is going to remain on the market or go off the market. Was that a fair assessment?
We'll have to wait to see, what the science says in terms of the regulation under the TSCA law. And once we make that determination of how we regulate it, I think we'll be able to answer that question for you.
Yeah, so, but let me get this straight. The evaluation you're going to do is based on science. It's not just somebody coming out and throwing darts at a dartboard, right?
Very thorough risk analysis. There's a rigorous course that we have to pursue based on the TSCA law that we intend to follow.
Okay, sounds good. I've got another question on Butte America, which also has a Superfund site due to some water contamination due to, copper extraction that wired this country. But we'll put that for the record, and you can get back to me on it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Administrator. It's good to see you again. I get to see you over on EPW committee quite a bit, so I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And I know that you are working to get things underway. I wanted to ask on the EPA's budget justification would devote hundreds of millions of dollars to environmental justice activities. You and I have talked about environmental justice and a little bit how I differ or I would expand that definition, I think would be a better way to put it. Last month, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council concluded that carbon capture, utilization, and storage and the procurement of nuclear power do not benefit environmental justice communities. So I guess I would ask if you agree with that assessment, and is that reflected in your budget in terms of your environmental sections of your budget?
I think the administration has been clear that carbon capture and storage and sequestration is one of our options for curbing these climate pollutants that we care so much about. I was just in North Dakota last week with both senators and the governor looking at the advanced research and development done, not only in the technology, but the understanding of the geological infrastructure that would support it. Our goal is to look at all of the technologies that are available that get the deepest emission cuts to curb the climate crisis.
So I guess what I'm asking more specifically is in your environmental justice part of your budget, which I'm not sure exactly, I can't figure out how much exactly that is, but I know it's a dedicated part of where you want to take and the president want to take the agency. Is there an exclusion, I guess, to what would be covered under environmental justice grants for certain communities? Would that be determined at the local level? Is this going to be determined by the committee who has concluded that nuclear power and carbon capture are not part of where you would see environmental justice inequities?
I think that those we would describe as site by site. I mean, carbon capture, sequestration, and storage can't be done everywhere. I think that as part of our permitting process, if we got to that stage, we would look at the implications of the application of that technology on surrounding communities to be sure that we're preserving the health of those communities. So I guess I can't say that we've looked at CCS as an environmental justice issue because we haven't gotten to the point where we're actually permitting projects to determine the implications on potential sites.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you just generally I know this is an issue that you dealt with in North Carolina on pipelines, and I know you're not the principal. You do have a peripheral responsibility on the permitting of pipelines, certainly in the water area and all that. Have you made any changes in that area in terms of what was going on during the Trump administration as opposed to what you plan to do in the future?
We haven't made any changes at EPA. I think that I maintain the same position I have as a state regulator. FERC has jurisdiction over that siting. We believe that communities should be engaged with FERC when sites are chosen. We believe that public participation in the NEPA process should inform where these routes are sited. Our job at EPA is to be sure that once these projects are sited, that we look at the implications from a water quality standpoint, environmental degradation standpoint, and sort of what that means to the communities that are in closest proximity. Site-by-site determinations, and that's what we're doing at EPA.
in committee and EPW and also here, you've mentioned in your written testimony, you mentioned too losing 1,000 professionals out of EPA. I think some of the folks at EPA actually went to the border. Am I correct on that? Some of the folks who work at EPA went to the border when the president called for additional help.
We have EPA employees that have volunteered for the assistance at the border for time periods of 30 to up to, I believe, 60 days. So there is a time where an employee can take 30 to 60 days, go and help with that humanitarian crisis, and then come back.
Even if you're down 1,000 people at the agency, you can afford to have that occur?
Well, listen, we've lost, in 2008, we had 18,000 employees. We're down to about 14,000 now. And the 1,000 employees that we're looking at not only replenish those that we lost, but just like every other agency, it's part of our succession plan, and we have an aging workforce. So we have to kind of plan for the future and think ahead. So there is sort of looking at the snapshot of now and in the foreseeable future, all of the challenges that this agency faces. To answer your question directly, yes, employees that want to take 30 to 60 days to volunteer for the humanitarian crisis, they have the ability to do so. And we have a structure in place where they work with their management to be sure that their duties are covered or don't interrupt the timelines for what we're on the hook to deliver.
Okay, all right. Thank you. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, too.
Thank you. Administrator, a number of colleagues have raised the question of environmental justice, and I'm so glad it's becoming part of the regular discussion in this committee and in your budget. Can you explain the Justice 40 commitment and how you're planning to carry it out?
So the Justice 40 commitment, as outlined by the President, looks at all of the direct and indirect implications of investments that go into infrastructure development, climate pollutant remediation, and the like. What we have at EPA is a strong partnership with all of our agencies to ensure that the criteria that flows from that Justice 40 fits into the way we conduct our business through our grant making and through our regulatory responsibilities. So we're very interested in not only looking at how we enforce the laws to ensure that we reduce the disproportionate impact, but as we move forward to rebuild these communities, that our grant programs and all of our technical assistance efforts match the President's desire to have 40% of those investments go back into these communities.
Is it fair for me to describe environmental justice as a recognition that pollutants are often concentrated in low-income communities and communities of color, and we need to make a special effort to address that challenge and remedy that situation?
The data shows clearly that there are communities that disproportionately bear the brunt of many types of air and water quality pollution. And so, yes, it is our responsibility to be sure that we take a look at how we remedy those situations through our programs, but also proactively as we look to the future, ensure that they don't happen again.
So I want to turn to plastics. Plastics have an enormous impact on the environment. We talk about the idea of reduce, reuse, recycle, but the reality for plastics is they're burned, buried, or borne out to sea. And it's not just those visible pieces of plastic that float out and fill the guts of our marine animals and kill life or litter our beaches. It's also the microplastics that are ingested. It's now estimated that each of us, because of how microplastics now permeate our air, water, and food, eat the equivalent or consume the equivalent of a credit card's worth of plastic every week. Plastic's full of chemicals, including endocrine disruptors that have a significant impact on human health. So what is EPA doing about plastics?
You know, under our purview and jurisdiction, we're focused on a few areas. The first is bolstering our partnership with the states around recycling programs. We really do have the capacity to help states build stronger recycling programs. But then there's another piece to that, and that's the education and outreach as well. We're really grappling with sort of the market conditions around recycling and what that means today versus what it meant 4 years ago. But nevertheless, through our through our grant programs, there are significant resources that go to states to help with the recycling programs that they have right there on the ground. And as you can imagine, the recycling programs and the level of effort varies from state to state, and we're there to help the states lead on that.
Are you familiar with the term wish cycling?
I wish cycling?
Mm-hmm.
No.
It's when you throw your plastic into a recyclable bucket thinking that you're recycling, but almost none of it's recycled. And in fact, in major institutions, and I would say this is probably true of the U.S. Senate, we have recycling buckets, people put plastic in it, and it just gets dumped into the trash. So it's something perhaps we should look at right here. But there's reasons for it. Because it's all kinds of materials of all kinds of sizes, single use. Here at the committee, we have the dais littered with plastic bottles. There's no recycling program for these. There's no national bottle bill. Oregon, which has one of the strongest recycling for plastic bottles, is about 80%. I think it may be the highest, which means 20% isn't recycled. Tremendous amount of plastic being burned. It puts these same poisons into the air. I really think EPA has to really up their effort on this. Do you share that opinion?
Absolutely. I think we could do a lot to strengthen U.S. recycling systems, and it is, it's a priority. I think in our traditional program, and the example you just gave is an example of where we have a strong suit, which is education and helping the states have the right structures in place. Obviously, Oregon has an opportunity to help EPA understand what certain states are doing in that leadership capacity and replicate that across the U.S.
I'll just say that despite Oregon's recycling, because it has a returnable deposit on bottles, it still recycles only a very small proportion of plastics. We have to think about different items being used in single use that are biodegradable, that do not come from fossil fuels. There's a lot of work to be done. Otherwise, we're just going to be amplifying the pretense that we're addressing the problem rather than the reality of addressing it. Yeah. Senator Murkowski.
Mr. Chairman, and know that I share your interest in what's going on with recycling. I think that this is an area that is so often overlooked, or to use your term, wish recycling. I think we need to be honest. And if people are going to take that extra step, thinking that what they're doing is helping to solve the problem, we need to be honest about that. We are an exceptionally wasteful country when it comes to whether it's things like plastics, and I noted, I think that you were drinking out of a water bottle, Mr. Chairman, not a plastic one. So I think you're setting a good standard and a model there. But this is, yeah.
Future meetings of this committee are not going to see plastic bottles on the dais.
I will bring my own water bottle. It's one of my favorites, and we will lead by example. I appreciate that. But I do think that this is an area that we can and must do more. I showed earlier a picture that was pretty horrible in terms of what goes on with our waste and the sanitation issues in villages. But one of the things that I have been following with great interest and really quite great concern is what is happening with our smaller landfills. In Alaska, it seems like all of our landfills came on at the same time. They're not very sophisticated. There's kind of a plastic lining, and you fill it up, and when you get to the top, you bulldoze it over and make another hole somewhere else. And our reality is that the maxing out of our landfills is going to be already and will be going forward. An issue that we've just got to get our hands around it. And so the more that we can be doing with recycling is important, and using those technologies that will allow us to get rid of some of this waste is a big issue, and one that I'd like to work with you on. Mr. Chairman, I don't have any more questions, but just a specific ask of the administrator. As I mentioned in my outset, I have appreciated the level of back and forth that we have already have. I mentioned to you that in previous administrations, I had worked out an agreement where we could have quarterly meetings with my team and a senior EPA team, usually led by the deputy administrator. These have really worked to solve some of the things that are very, very local, very parochial, and that really shouldn't occupy the time of a broader gathering of members. But I would just ask for your continued commitment, Administrator Regan, to hold quarterly meetings with my team on some of these punch list items so that we can get to them before they become real problems. And I would hope that we would be able to continue that.
Yes, I think we can definitely continue these senior leadership meetings and continue to focus on solving these problems. So I don't see a problem with that at all. And hopefully whoever that senior leader we choose will be joining me when we visit Alaska in August.
Very good. We look forward to that. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the good conversation this morning in committee.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Murkowski, and I appreciate your interest in working together on this plastics challenge. We see the beaches in Oregon covered. We see marine life that's dying because their guts are full of plastic. We have increased prostate and breast cancer that many believe is being affected by the endocrine disruptors that come out of plastics prevalence. And it really is an area that has not gotten the attention it needs. And so it's worth our efforts, and thank you for your offer to work on that. And I appreciate your dramatic presentation of the sanitary water infrastructure challenge of Alaska. In my state, think about the small towns that have just been burned by fires, and people are trying to rebuild their homes, but the requirements for sanitary systems are different than they were 60, 70, 80 years ago when a lot of these homes were built. And small towns, 500 to 1,000 people, the cost of a modern sanitary system is absolutely about the same whether you have 1,000 people or you have 5,000 people. And so it's an impossible charge. And so in order to prevent these towns from being paralyzed or decimated by the challenge of sanitary water systems and clean water systems, we need a significant grant component. Low-interest loans just isn't enough. There is waiver power under these programs, but I think we need to explore, and it's come up with many folks here. I was just out visiting a community that was burned to the ground, Blue River, and the first infrastructure we've got put back in place with the post office. That's the kind of the heart of a community, and it's kind of a symbolic bridge to the outside world, but the homes all around have not been rebuilt. And figuring out the sanitary system is a big part of that. And a lot of these small towns, all the governing officials are volunteers, and they're trying to address a very complicated issue. And when they hear about the fees it costs just to get an engineering assessment of what the best practices are or best possibilities, can they pipe their sanitary sewage to another town down the road? Can they use various forms of biotreatment for tertiary treatment? They need help with the grants for the upfront costs of understanding their best options. And I had proposed, and we now have launched, a circuit rider program for the ability to help small towns evaluate. But this, I think you've heard from so many members today about the importance of water infrastructure in small towns. They're trying to meet modern standards. They're trying to provide for the possibility of the towns growing. Some of these small towns have a very exciting development because of COVID, because people became so familiar with Zoom, they found, hey, I don't have to live in a city in order to participate in the modern economy if I have a role that can be accomplished over Zoom. That's a real opportunity for our small towns, but they need help with that infrastructure. I want to turn to TSCA. And it was really a major effort of bipartisan effort, amazing bipartisan accomplishment back in about 2016 when we adopted the Lautenberg restructuring of TSCA to try to say, hey, TSCA doesn't really, I mean, Americans are astounded to find out that there's no real regulation of the chemicals that go into ordinary household products. So here we are now, 4 years into the implementation of the Lautenberg rewrite of TSCA, and I hear you talking about doing risk analysis on the top 10 chemicals. Risk analysis should have been completed years ago. I mean, every major developed country has gotten rid of asbestos except for us. So I'm kind of frightened by the idea we're still stuck in evaluating the risk when this is one of the best understood issues that faces the modern world and that every other nation has taken action on. Can you tell me how we can get out of this cycle of being forever moving the bureaucratic pieces around on asbestos and actually take action on it?
I can tell you that the president ordered a reexamination of some of the science and the decisions that were made during the previous administration. And the thing that's slowing us down is the scientific integrity and the record that was built the last 4 years. So what's slowing us down is the lack of action that occurred the last 4 years. But I can assure you that we're making up for lost time, and we're taking the latest science and doing the proper risk evaluation so that when we get to the point of regulation of asbestos, we won't have any concerns in terms of scientific integrity. And also in this budget, I think you'll see that we've requested $15 million to add 87 positions to be sure that we can play catch-up on the work that was lost on implementing TSCA.
Well, I hope that every day you can spend part of the day calling and pushing to get TSCA underway, because it's, let's take that top 10 list. Dry cleaning, carcinogens, fluid, TCE. No action that I know of. Am I right?
They are in the top 10 that we are currently doing an evaluation, a risk evaluation that we believe in the near future we will be able to take action on.
Methylene chloride, a paint stripper, still no action. This is not, obviously, you just came to the team. We have a new administration. My point is that almost every week I find out about a friend or an associate who has cancer. Almost every week. And I think that's true probably everyone in this room. A lot of that stems from complicated chemicals we've introduced that have impacts. Other nations are saying, let's get those things out of our products. Well, we passed a law to get that done. That's now in your hands.
Yes.
And so it's a pretty significant responsibility. I appreciate your taking it on seriously, but I think you have to constantly push, because otherwise it's always, well, we can get a little more perfect science. We can get one more study. We have thousands of studies on many of these chemicals. And so the point comes, you can't study things forever. There's a point, this is a risk, let's get it out of our products. That's your job. And I'm looking forward to your being able to tell me we have now gotten that chemical out of the products that ordinary people experience every day.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Not just asbestos, but many, many, many others. So I want to turn to smoke. It's something that we hear about in terms of firefighters entering buildings and the people dying in buildings, not just of fire, but of smoke inhalation. But now we have the problem of forest fires, which are leaving smoke lingering in the air with people and breathing it, great aggravation of asthma. The small particulates are very, very harmful. Has EPA started to think about wildfire smoke as a significant pollutant that needs to be addressed?
We are really taking a close look at what we're seeing before our eyes in terms of the increase, intensity from the byproducts of climate change. What I'll say is the answer is we are taking the wildfire smoke very serious, which is why in this budget we're asking for an increase in our air quality monitoring system. Not only do we want to get better at predicting the climate science and when we think we will see this occur, but we want to be able to have the monitors in place so that we can measure, verify, and inform the public of how to be most protective of their public health.
Well, obviously, I like to see these big fires not happen in the first place, and that includes forest management strategies that make forests more resilient. It certainly means a major effort to tackle the methane gases and carbon dioxide gases that are heating our planet so quickly. But we also need to help communities live with better health when there is smoke, as there is regularly, and there's a variety of strategies to help address that. My final question is just to turn to tailpipe emissions, because they are such a large source of climate warming gases. And this question was asked before, but I just wanted to raise it again. The Diesel Emission Reduction Act program. Can this help us in pursuing an EV transition? And are there other key regulatory opportunities to help drive the transmission to radically reduce carbon dioxide from ordinary vehicles?
Absolutely. The tailpipe emissions and transportation emissions are the largest contributor. We're laser focused on it. I believe DERA is absolutely a mechanism. We also have the regulatory authority to pursue this as well, and in mid-July you'll see EPA do a notice of proposed rulemaking for tailpipe emissions for cars. We're also focused on heavy-duty vehicles as well. The transportation sector is so important from a climate change, global warming perspective, but also from a localized pollution and environmental justice perspective. We've got the tools to address it. We're moving forward quickly, and the last thing I'll say is also the reestablishment of the statutory authority of states like California and others who want to take a leadership role and expedite that timeline. We support that as well.
Okay. Often we think about electric vehicles might work well for passenger vehicles, but maybe not for heavy machinery. And I'm very interested in visiting a pilot project in Oregon that involves electric tractors and farmers who are experimenting with whether they work effectively. And the early reports are they sure are impressed by the torque on electric tractors. Is there anything else you would like to add in closing, Senator?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you so much, Administrator Reagan. And if my eyesight was better, I would repeat the name of your assistant.
Mr. David Bloom.
Thank you, Mr. Bloom, for standing by with a lot of expertise on the budget. If there are no other statements, the hearing record will be open until close of business on January 23rd. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.